There is a crop that defies every rule of modern agriculture. Plant it once and it feeds your family for 20 years. It outproduces corn without fertilizer. It survives droughts that kill wheat. It builds soil instead of depleting it. And for thousands of years, it sustained entire civilizations across North America. Then we erased it from memory. We did not abandon it because it failed. We abandoned it because it succeeded too well. A crop that grows without permission cannot be sold. A harvest that returns without replanting cannot generate annual profits. And knowledge that creates independence threatens every system built on scarcity. This is the story of the forever crops we were taught to forget. Welcome to Forgotten Earthworks. Before European ships reached these shores, vast fields stretched across the eastern woodlands. Not corn, not wheat, something older, something that planted itself. Native communities from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico cultivated crops that modern agriculture insists are impossible. Perennial grains and vegetables that returned every spring without human intervention. Harvests that increased over time instead of exhausting the soil. Food systems so resilient they supported millions of people for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence reveals the scope of what we lost. At sites across Kentucky and Arkansas, researchers discovered seed caches dating back 6,000 years. These were not wild forage plants stored accidentally. They were carefully selected, processed, and preserved varieties that could only exist through deliberate cultivation. The seeds belong to crops that have no modern equivalent, plants bred for abundance over millennia, then abandoned so completely that we forgot they ever existed. The indigenous farmers who developed these systems understood something we have forgotten. Annual crops demand constant labor, depleting soil and requiring new seeds every season. But perennial crops build wealth over time. Plant once, harvest forever. The roots grow deeper each year, accessing nutrients and water that surface crops cannot reach. The soil becomes richer, not poorer. The harvest becomes more abundant, not less. One of these lost crops still grows wild in forgotten corners of the continent. Jerusalem artichoke, known to its native cultivators as the sunroot. Modern agriculture classifies it as a weed. Agricultural departments publish bulletins on how to eradicate it. Yet this single plant produces more calories per acre than most cultivated grains while requiring no inputs, no irrigation, and no replanting. The Jerusalem artichoke towers 8 to 10 feet tall, crowned with bright yellow sunflowers. But the treasure lies underground. Knobby tubers storing concentrated energy as inulin, not starch. Native communities planted it once and harvested for generations. A single plant produces 3 to 6 pounds of food annually. An established patch yields more nutrition than wheat or corn in cold climates, with studies documenting harvests exceeding 64,000 pounds per acre without irrigation. The nutritional profile reveals why indigenous peoples considered it foundational. 1 cup provides 28% of daily iron requirements, 18% of potassium, and 10% of vitamin C. The inulin content creates prebiotic fiber that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. Unlike regular starches that spike blood sugar, inulin feeds beneficial gut bacteria and provides sustained energy without metabolic chaos. Diabetics who discovered Jerusalem artichokes in the 1980s wrote testimonials claiming their insulin needs dropped by half. This was survival technology disguised as food. The tubers could be eaten fresh, dried into flour, or left in the ground as living storage. They survived freezing temperatures and remained viable for years. When Lewis and Clark nearly starved crossing the Dakotas in 1805, Sacagawea saved the expedition by locating mouse caches filled with thousands of stored tubers. The indigenous knowledge that created those caches had sustained communities through countless winters. But Jerusalem artichokes were just one component of a sophisticated agricultural system. Across the eastern woodlands, native farmers cultivated goosefoot, erect knotweed, and marsh elder alongside sunflowers and squash. These were not minor crops supplementing corn. Archaeological evidence shows they formed the foundation of settled agricultural communities for thousands of years before corn arrived from Mexico. Recent research growing these lost varieties achieved yields comparable to modern quinoa and buckwheat, proving their productivity was never the problem. The problem was control. European colonization brought annual grains that required purchasing seeds every year, crops that could be taxed, measured, and sold through established markets. The self-perpetuating abundance of perennial systems threatened the entire economic model of agricultural expansion. Indigenous crops that enabled food sovereignty had to be replaced with varieties that created dependence. The systematic erasure was not accidental. Colonial administrators understood that agricultural independence meant political independence. Communities growing their own perennial food systems could not be controlled through scarcity. So the knowledge was suppressed, the seeds were lost, and the fields were plowed under for wheat and corn. Within generations, crops that had sustained millions became weeds to be eradicated. Today, industrial agriculture faces the consequences of that erasure. Soil depletion, water scarcity, and climate instability threaten the annual crops we depend on. Modern farmers apply millions of tons of synthetic fertilizer to replace the nutrients their systems destroy. They pump groundwater at unsustainable rates to irrigate crops with shallow roots. They spray herbicides to kill the very plants that could solve their problems. Meanwhile, the solution grows wild in ditches and abandoned lots. Jerusalem artichokes spread through underground networks, building soil with every passing year. Their 10-foot roots access deep water tables and mine minerals from the subsoil. They require no fossil fuel inputs and produce no agricultural waste. They represent everything modern agriculture claims to want, but refuses to acknowledge. The few researchers studying perennial crops report results that should revolutionize farming. Kernza wheat, a perennial grain developed from wild intermediate wheatgrass, produces yields approaching commercial varieties while building soil carbon and preventing erosion. Its roots extend 10 feet deep, sequestering carbon and accessing nutrients that annual crops waste. If adopted widely, perennial grains could transform agriculture from a carbon source into a carbon sink. But the infrastructure remains hostile to perennial abundance. Agricultural universities train students to think in annual cycles. Government programs subsidize annual crops while ignoring perennial alternatives. Seed companies profit from varieties that must be purchased repeatedly, not those that perpetuate themselves. The entire system depends on scarcity, where abundance threatens profit margins. The indigenous farmers who created these systems understood that true wealth comes from permanence, not extraction. They planted for their great-grandchildren, not quarterly profits. They bred crops that strengthened over time, not varieties designed for single seasons. That knowledge survived colonization, survived industrialization, and waits underground for anyone willing to remember. The war against perennial abundance intensified throughout the 20th century. Chemical companies discovered that farmers dependent on annual crops would purchase fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides every single year. But farmers growing perennial systems needed nothing. The economic threat was existential. In 1946, agricultural extension agents began publishing technical bulletins specifically targeting Jerusalem artichokes and other perennial crops. They branded them invasive weeds requiring aggressive chemical control. Universities conducted research on killing plants that had fed civilizations. The same institutions that should have been studying perennial productivity instead developed herbicides to eradicate it from existence. The propaganda was surgical. They convinced farmers that abundance without control meant chaos, that plants spreading without permission represented failure, not success, that crops requiring no inputs were worthless compared to varieties demanding constant purchases. The narrative inverted reality so completely that food security became synonymous with agricultural dependence. Meanwhile, other regions never forgot. In parts of Canada, indigenous communities continued cultivating Jerusalem artichokes through centuries of suppression. In remote areas of the Great Lakes region, wild populations maintained genetic diversity lost elsewhere. The knowledge persisted in scattered pockets, waiting for the moment when industrial systems would reveal their fragility. That moment arrived with climate change. Extreme weather events exposed the vulnerability of annual monocultures. Drought stress that kills corn and wheat barely affects deep-rooted perennials. Flooding that destroys conventional crops cannot reach tubers stored safely underground. The resilience that made perennial systems inconvenient for industrial agriculture now makes them essential for survival. Modern researchers rediscovering these crops report findings that should dominate agricultural headlines. Perennial grains can increase soil carbon by 50% while producing comparable yields to annual varieties. Root systems extending 15 feet deep prevent erosion and capture nutrients that would otherwise leach away. Established perennial crops suppress weeds naturally, eliminating herbicide applications worth billions annually. Yet the infrastructure remains dedicated to annual extraction. Agricultural colleges teach courses on corn and soy while ignoring crops that could revolutionize farming. Government subsidies flow to industrial monocultures while perennial alternatives receive no support. Seed catalogs offer hundreds of annual varieties while perennial crops remain virtually unavailable through commercial channels. The suppression extends beyond economics into psychology. Modern consumers expect food to appear uniform, processed, and packaged. Jerusalem artichokes look strange, knobby, and irregular compared to potatoes bred for visual perfection. Their inulin content causes digestive adjustment in populations raised on processed starches. Industrial food systems demand instant satisfaction, not the patience required for biological adaptation. But the adaptation period reveals the deeper truth. Crops that challenge our digestive systems also heal them. The beneficial bacteria that flourish on inulin create short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation and support immune function. The complex carbohydrates that initially cause discomfort eventually strengthen gut health in ways processed foods never could. Traditional peoples understood this relationship between food and health that modern nutrition has forgotten. The economic model that suppressed perennial crops now faces its own extinction. Synthetic fertilizer production consumes enormous quantities of natural gas while generating massive carbon emissions. Water tables drop as irrigation demands exceed sustainable rates. Soil erosion eliminates topsoil faster than natural processes can replace it. The system built on annual extraction approaches ecological collapse. Perennial crops offer an exit strategy that threatens every assumption about modern agriculture. Jerusalem artichokes produce more nutrition per acre than wheat, while building soil carbon and requiring zero fossil fuel inputs. Established stands increase productivity over decades rather than depleting resources year after year. They represent abundance that grows stronger with time rather than weaker. The knowledge required to implement perennial systems already exists. Indigenous agricultural techniques developed over millennia created sustainable abundance that supported millions of people. Modern permaculture practitioners demonstrate that these methods work in contemporary contexts. Small-scale farmers growing perennial crops report higher profits with less labor than conventional operations. But scaling perennial systems requires dismantling the infrastructure of annual dependence. Seed companies would lose revenue from varieties that replant themselves. Chemical manufacturers would lose markets for inputs that perennial crops do not need. Equipment dealers would lose sales to farmers who no longer require annual tillage. The entire industrial food system depends on preventing the abundance that perennial crops naturally create. The resistance is not merely economic, but ideological. Industrial agriculture teaches that nature requires constant management to be productive. that wild systems are chaotic and unreliable compared to human-controlled monocultures. That abundance without intervention is impossible. Perennial crops prove every assumption false. Communities beginning to remember these truths start small. Backyard gardeners plant Jerusalem artichokes and watch them multiply year after year. Homesteaders establish food forests that produce increasing harvests with decreasing labor. Urban farmers discover that perennial vegetables require less water and space than annual crops while producing more nutrition. Each successful perennial system becomes proof that the industrial narrative was always a lie, that abundance does not require extraction, that sustainability means permanence, not constant replacement, that true food security comes from crops that strengthen communities rather than weakening them through dependence. The plants themselves remain patient teachers. Jerusalem artichokes continue spreading through abandoned lots and forgotten corners, building soil and storing energy regardless of human recognition. Their persistence through centuries of suppression demonstrates the resilience that sustained civilizations before industrial agriculture convinced us that food could only come from annual destruction. The forever crops are still here, still growing in ditches and abandoned fields, still offering 20 years of harvest from a single planting, still building soil while industrial agriculture destroys it. The agricultural system that erased them is collapsing under its own contradictions. Soil depletion, water scarcity, and climate chaos expose the fragility of annual dependence. But perennial abundance waits underground, patient as stone, ready to feed the communities brave enough to remember. Plant once, feed generations. The choice has always been yours.